It began with a hum. At first, it was a barely perceptible fluctuation in the data streams of Earth's most advanced satellite network. The world's leading astronomers and scientists dismissed it as static, just another anomaly in the vast expanse of space. But then, the hum turned into a rhythmic pulse, an unmistakable pattern that could no longer be ignored. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a cryptographer with an unparalleled knack for solving complex puzzles, was one of the first to notice. She had spent years analyzing deep space signals, searching for any trace of intelligent life beyond Earth. Most of her work had been inconclusive, a series of dead ends and empty static. But this time, something was different. There was order within the noise. A repeating sequence of symbols, intricate, geometric, and distinctly non-human, emerged from the depths of the signal. When Evelyn examined the data, her pulse quickened. The symbols were unlike anything seen before. No known language or code matched their structure. Her heart raced as she began to draw connections between the characters. They weren't just random marks. They were a carefully constructed language, a code wrapped in layers of complexity. This wasn't just a message, it was a challenge. The government quickly took notice, summoning an elite team of scientists, engineers, and military experts to examine the signal. It became clear that this wasn't just a signal from deep space, it was a message deliberately sent to Earth. But by who, and why now? The global scientific community buzzed with excitement, yet beneath the surface, there was a growing sense of unease. Evelyn's decoding software worked overtime as she and her team tried to make sense of the runes. As the first set of symbols was decrypted, the world watched in anticipation. The runes shifted and evolved, almost as if they were alive. They resembled ancient writing, but their patterns, always shifting, always changing, were unlike anything in human history. Then, without warning, the first strange event occurred. The massive energy grid that powered North America flickered, then went dark. The electric lights across the continent dimmed in unison, as if the power itself had been drained. Minutes later, it was reported that the same phenomenon was happening in Europe, Asia, and Africa. A global energy disturbance. No one knew why or how. It was as if the signal had triggered an unseen force, disrupting Earth's technological infrastructure in a heartbeat. Evelyn was pulled into an emergency meeting with world leaders, military officials, and other experts. The room was filled with tension as they discussed the implications of the runes. What could these symbols mean? Who could have sent them? And why was the world now experiencing bizarre phenomena as a result? As Evelyn sat at the head of the table, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The message was just the beginning. There was something far greater at play, something hidden in the signal's shifting symbols, something ancient, powerful, and far beyond humanity's understanding. The final rune was yet to be revealed, and as Evelyn stared at the screen, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Whoever had sent this message was not simply trying to communicate, they were trying to prepare humanity for something unimaginable. And the countdown had already begun. It began with a hum. At first, it was a barely perceptible fluctuation in the data streams of Earth's most advanced satellite network. The world's leading astronomers and scientists dismissed it as static, just another anomaly in the vast expanse of space. But then, the hum turned into a rhythmic pulse, an unmistakable pattern that could no longer be ignored. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a cryptographer with an unparalleled knack for solving complex puzzles, was one of the first to notice. She had spent years analyzing deep space signals, searching for any trace of intelligent life beyond Earth. Most of her work had been inconclusive, a series of dead ends and empty static. But this time, something was different. There was order within the noise. A repeating sequence of symbols, intricate, geometric, and distinctly non-human, emerged from the depths of the signal. When Evelyn examined the data, her pulse quickened. The symbols were unlike anything seen before. No known language or code matched their structure. Her heart raced as she began to draw connections between the characters. They weren't just random marks, they were a carefully constructed language, a code wrapped in layers of complexity. This wasn't just a message, it was a challenge. The government quickly took notice, summoning an elite team of scientists, engineers, and military experts to examine the signal. It became clear that this wasn't just a signal from deep space, it was a message, deliberately sent to Earth. But by who and why now? The global scientific community buzzed with excitement, yet beneath the surface, there was a growing sense of unease. Evelyn's decoding software worked overtime as she and her team tried to make sense of the runes. As the first set of symbols was decrypted, the world watched in anticipation. The runes shifted and evolved, almost as if they were alive. They resembled ancient writing, but their patterns— The chamber was vast, stretching beyond the limits of human comprehension. Evelyn and her team hovered on the edge of it, their lights flickering across walls etched with ancient symbols. The floor was composed of smooth, polished black stone, almost reflective, while the ceiling stretched far above them, an unfathomable distance away. It was clear this was no ordinary structure. It was a place of unimaginable power, ancient and untouched by time. The team slowly made their way through the open doors, which had begun to close behind them, as though the chamber had waited millennia for this moment. As they ventured deeper into the heart of the structure, they found themselves surrounded by tall columns, each engraved with more runes. But it wasn't the runes that grabbed their attention, it was the sensation in the air. It felt heavy, electric, alive with a pulse that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "I don't like this," said Dr. Malcolm Hayes, one of the team's physicists. His voice was laced with concern, but Evelyn didn't share his hesitation. She was too absorbed in the mystery. This was the discovery of a lifetime, perhaps even of all human history. Yet a gnawing feeling in her gut told her something was wrong. Something had been waiting for them here. They reached the center of the chamber, and the floor shifted beneath their feet, almost imperceptibly. At the core of the room stood a massive ancient pedestal, its surface covered in intricate, glowing runes, pulsating with the same red energy as the signal that had led them here. But it wasn't just a pedestal. The closer they approached, the more Evelyn could sense something within it, something alive. Suddenly, the ground trembled. A low, guttural hum filled the chamber, vibrating the air around them. The runes on the pedestal flared to life, and Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. They weren't just symbols. They were part of a living, breathing system designed to interact with them. As the energy intensified, dark shadows began to shift in the corners of the room. From the depths of the pedestal, something stirred, something ancient, something powerful. Evelyn's eyes widened as the ground cracked open, revealing a massive, armored figure emerging from the depths of the chamber. It stood towering above them, encased in an exoskeleton of dark metal, its eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. A being far older than humanity, perhaps older than anything on Earth. The team froze in shock. This wasn't just a dormant power source. It was a guardian, a protector bound to the power within the chamber. But as the creature's gaze swept over them, Evelyn realized with horror that it wasn't simply guarding the power, it was the power. The energy source was alive, a sentient force bound to these ancient entities. The crimson runes weren't just instructions. They were a way to awaken the entities that had been sealed away for eons. Before anyone could react, the creature's form began to shift, becoming translucent, its body merging with the swirling energy around it. The air itself seemed to bend and warp, as though the chamber had become a doorway to another dimension. The team scrambled back, weapons drawn, but it was clear that this wasn't a being that could be fought. It wasn't a creature of flesh, it was a manifestation of pure energy, capable of manipulating the fabric of reality itself. The room began to fill with whispers, a language no human had ever heard. Evelyn felt her mind tugged in all directions, as though the entity was trying to reach inside her thoughts, probing her consciousness. It was then that she realized the runes, the symbols, were not just a message. They were a language that bridged two worlds, and the creatures here were not bound by time or space. They had existed before the birth of Earth itself. "Get out, now," shouted Hayes, panic creeping into his voice. But it was already too late. As the first of the other creatures began to emerge, shadows taking form from the dark corners of the chamber, a rumbling sound reverberated throughout the room. The chamber began to close in on itself, walls shifting, doors sealing tight. The team was trapped. Evelyn's mind raced. The signal, the runes, hadn't been a call for help. They had been a summons. The entities weren't the ones in danger. They had been waiting for someone to awaken them. And now that they had been freed, they would stop at nothing to regain their power and reshape the world. They weren't alone in this chamber anymore. The battle for Earth's future had begun. The chamber began to tremble as the air grew thick with an unnatural energy. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the pressure of the entity's presence growing stronger with each passing second. The whispers in the air, once faint, now crescendoed into a maddening cacophony, a voice that filled every corner of her mind. It wasn't a single voice, but many, different, ancient, and incomprehensible. The team's efforts to retreat were futile. The walls of the chamber shifted, as if the very structure itself had become a living, breathing entity, closing off their exits. Evelyn's hands shook as she tried to regain control of her thoughts. The creatures that had emerged from the pedestal were circling them, their forms flickering between solid and translucent, ever-changing, like reflections in a broken mirror. Each one exuded a terrible, palpable power. Beings that had slumbered for eons, now awakened and free. "Stay calm. We need to focus," Evelyn whispered, trying to steady herself. "We can't let them manipulate us." But it was clear that the runes had done something to them. The energy that had flooded the chamber was not just from the creatures. It was emanating from the Earth itself, spreading outward like a virus. The atmosphere was charged, the very fabric of reality beginning to warp. The ground cracked open beneath them, revealing strange, glowing symbols beneath the surface, as if the entire planet was responding to the awakening of these entities. The team had no time to plan their next move. With a violent crack, the floor gave way, and a massive rift appeared, a swirling vortex of light and shadow, ripping through the chamber's foundation. The rift opened wide, sending tendrils of dark energy spiraling out across the chamber. It was as though the fabric of space-time had been torn open, revealing an abyss beyond comprehension. The creatures moved toward the rift, their forms becoming more solid as they merged with the dark energy emanating from the rift. Evelyn watched in horror as they began to shift the rift's energy, feeding it, enhancing it. Whatever had been sealed away for millennia was now breaking free. "Get back," Evelyn shouted, pulling her team away from the expanding vortex. But it was already too late. The rift, once a small tear, now stretched wide, swallowing everything in its path. The very air was sucked into it, creating a vacuum that threatened to tear them apart. As the team backed away, the ground quaked violently, and massive shards of stone began to lift from the floor, suspended by the force of the rift. The creatures, their forms fully solidified now, moved toward the edges of the rift, their glowing eyes filled with an eerie intelligence. The energy pouring from the rift surged into the atmosphere, cascading across the globe. Satellites, now useless, began to malfunction. Electric grids worldwide flickered and shorted out, as though the rift was siphoning off power from every source it could find. Communications went down across entire continents, and the world plunged into an eerie silence. Evelyn's mind raced. This was the true purpose of the runes, to open the rift. The ancient entities, now in control of the rift, had begun to tear apart the boundaries between dimensions. They weren't just reshaping the world, they were unlocking something far greater, something beyond Earth. The creatures spoke again, their voices echoing in unison, a chilling command that seemed to reverberate deep in Evelyn's bones. The message was clear now. The world was theirs to conquer. This was only the beginning. Desperately, Evelyn turned to her team, her eyes wide with realization. We need to close this rift, now. If we don't, they'll break through, and it won't just be Earth they'll reshape. It'll be everything. Time, space, reality itself. But as the rift continued to grow, the rumbles of the Earth itself growing louder, the team realized they were fighting against something far older, far more powerful than anything humanity had ever known. The battle for Earth's survival had just begun, and the rift was only the first sign of the chaos to come. Evelyn's mind raced as she looked at the massive rift tearing through the very fabric of reality. The creatures, now fully emerged from their slumber, were feeding the rift's power, their forms flickering with dark energy. The air around them was charged, crackling with an electric intensity that felt as though it could rupture at any moment. She could feel it deep in her chest. This wasn't just a physical battle. This was a war for the survival of Earth itself, a fight against forces that had existed long before humanity had even risen from the primordial depths. "Malcolm," Evelyn shouted, pulling her thoughts back to the team. "Do you have any idea how to stop this?" Dr. Malcolm Hayes was hunched over his portable terminal, frantically typing in commands. His brow was furrowed in concentration, but his face was pale with fear. "We're out of time, Evelyn," he said, his voice strained. "The rift is feeding off the planet's electromagnetic field. It's already destabilizing the entire planet. If we don't close it soon, it will expand uncontrollably." Evelyn's eyes darted to the rift, now yawning wider with every passing second. Pieces of the chamber, as well as large chunks of the ocean floor, were being pulled into the rift's gravitational pull. The ground beneath them trembled violently, making it almost impossible to keep their footing. "What about the runes? Could they help us?" Evelyn asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "They're more than just symbols," Malcolm replied, his fingers hovering over the terminal. "These runes are part of a complex system, an energy conduit that channels power between dimensions. It's not just a message. It's a key, one that unlocks something beyond this reality." "Beyond this reality?" Evelyn repeated, a sinking feeling settling in her gut. The rift was more than just a breach in the Earth's crust. It was a portal, a gateway to something far beyond their understanding. At that moment, the creatures began to move again. Their forms shimmered in the charged air, and they began to converge around the rift, their eyes glowing brighter. They were not just watching, they were directing the energy. The creatures weren't just guardians. They were the architects of the rift. They had designed this rupture between worlds, and now they were using it to tear through the boundaries of existence itself. As Evelyn stood there, her mind racing, a dark realization hit her. The ancient entities didn't need the rift to stay open. They were the ones keeping it open. Their power was what sustained it. The only way to close the rift would be to sever their connection to it, to break their hold on the rift's energy source. But how? "We need to disrupt the rift's energy source, cut off their power," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If we can sever their link, we can close the rift." Malcolm nodded grimly. "The problem is, the rift's energy is tied to the core of the planet itself. The creatures are using the Earth's own energy to fuel it. Which means we have to find a way to disrupt their control," Evelyn said, her eyes scanning the chamber. She knew they didn't have much time. "Can we use the runes to turn off the energy flow?" Malcolm's fingers flew across the terminal as he analyzed the symbols. "There might be a way. If we can channel the energy back through the runes, reverse the flow, we could destabilize the rift. But we'll need to access the main conduit at the center of the chamber. It's the heart of their power." The creatures began to stir again, their glowing eyes locking onto the team. It was clear they knew what Evelyn and her team were planning. As they moved closer, the atmosphere grew even heavier, the pressure in the room building. Evelyn could feel the weight of their attention pressing down on her like an iron fist. "We don't have much time," Malcolm warned, looking at the advancing entities. "They're coming for us." Suddenly, a wave of dark energy erupted from the rift, lashing out toward the team. The creatures moved in unison, their bodies flowing with the force of the rift, their energy turning into a destructive torrent. The room shook violently as the shockwave from the rift blasted outward, pushing the team back. "Get to the center," Evelyn shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the energy surge. "We need to reach the main conduit now." With no other option, Evelyn and her team sprinted toward the center of the chamber, where a massive glowing core pulsed with the energy of the rift. The creatures were closing in fast, their movements predatory, their forms becoming more solid as they tapped into the rift's power. As they reached the core, Evelyn held up her hand, calling on the ancient runes once more. She traced her fingers over the glowing symbols, feeling the energy flow beneath her fingertips. The rift was alive, it was sentient, and it could feel her touch. "Now," Evelyn shouted, the team deployed their final device, a resonance disruptor designed to overload the rift's energy channels. As the device hummed to life, the runes around them flared, sending a pulse of energy through the chamber. The core trembled, and the rift's energy flickered, just for a moment, but that moment was enough. The creatures screamed in unison, a sound that shook the very air around them. The rift began to retract, slowly at first, but then with growing force. It was closing, but the creatures wouldn't let go without a fight. The battle for the rift was far from over, but for now, Earth had a fighting chance. The rift pulsed one last time, a final surge of dark energy flooding the chamber before the light began to fade. The air around them grew still, and the oppressive hum that had filled their ears suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The rift contracted rapidly, collapsing into itself as if it had never existed at all. But Evelyn knew better. The creatures, the guardians of the rift, were not so easily defeated. As the energy dissipated, the creatures stopped moving. Their glowing eyes dimmed, and they began to flicker between solidity and translucency. They were retreating, not disappearing, but waiting, regrouping. Evelyn's heart pounded as she took in the scene. The rift was sealed, but for how long? "Is it over?" Dr. Hayes asked, his voice filled with cautious hope. The device they had activated, the resonance disruptor, had sent a shockwave of energy through the core, severing the creature's connection to the rift. The power had been diverted, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they had only delayed the inevitable. "I don't think so," Evelyn muttered, her gaze still fixed on the creatures. "They're just waiting." As if on cue, the creatures began to stir again, their forms flickering violently as they reasserted their power. The walls of the chamber began to rumble, and the ground beneath their feet cracked open once more. The runes on the pedestal flared to life, glowing brighter than ever before. "We need to get out of here," Malcolm said urgently, looking around the chamber. The shifting walls and violent tremors were becoming too dangerous, but Evelyn's mind was already racing. "We can't leave yet," she said, her voice unwavering. "We need to figure out what these creatures want, why they're here, and what they're after. If we don't, they'll just come back again." A cold realization settled over her. These entities had been sealed away for millennia. The rift was their means of re-entering their domain, a place beyond the boundaries of the Earth. But why now? Why had the rift been activated at this moment in history? Evelyn turned to the device they had used to disrupt the rift, the resonance disruptor. It had been designed to overload the rift's energy channels, but it hadn't completely severed the connection. They had only bought themselves time. "They've been feeding off Earth's energy," Evelyn continued. "They don't need the rift to remain open forever. They just need a way to access the power they left behind." Hayes looked at her in disbelief. "You think they're using us? They're manipulating us into awakening them, to feed off our planet's resources." Evelyn nodded grimly. I don't think they're using us. I think they're coercing us. The runes weren't just a call, they were a plan. A blueprint for how to return, how to break through. The tremors grew stronger as the entities gathered again, their energy now crackling in the air. The room was beginning to shake uncontrollably, and pieces of the chamber's walls began to disintegrate, crumbling away like sand in a storm. The pressure was building to an unbearable level. We have to stop them from completing the ritual, Evelyn said, more to herself than to anyone else. If we can stop them from finishing their energy transfer, we can prevent the rift from reopening. A sound like thunder cracked through the air. The creatures' forms began to merge with the energy fields around them, their bodies taking on an almost liquid-like quality as they poured themselves into the glowing symbols on the walls. The symbols were reacting to them, the chamber transforming into a living system. The walls began to bend, twisting and warping as if reality itself was being rewritten. The team backed away, trying to find some semblance of safety, but Evelyn knew there was no safe place here. The creatures were in control now, their energy weaving itself into the very structure of the chamber. We need to find the heart of the system, Evelyn said, her voice steady. If we can reach the core before they finish their ritual, we might be able to destroy the conduit. But even as she spoke, the floor beneath them shattered. A massive tendril of dark energy shot up from the center of the chamber, wrapping around them, pulling them toward the heart of the power. The creatures were in full control now, the rift's energy bending to their will. Time was running out, and the team was being dragged toward the core. Evelyn's mind raced. If they didn't stop them now, they would not only lose the battle, they would lose the entire planet. And yet, she knew that every move they made could trigger the next catastrophe. "Stay close," she shouted, as the tendril of energy tightened around them. She had no choice but to fight back. The battle for the future of Earth had reached its tipping point. Evelyn's pulse quickened as the tendril of dark energy tightened around them, pulling them toward the heart of the chamber. The walls, now bending and warping with the pulse of the rift, made it feel as if reality itself was unraveling. The air was thick with the oppressive weight of the creature's power, and the strange, otherworldly whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were closing in on their goal, the final phase of the ritual, but Evelyn wasn't ready to surrender. "Hold on," she shouted, her voice barely cutting through the overwhelming hum of the energy. Her hands gripped the cold surface of the floor as the force of the tendril jerked her forward. The others were close behind, struggling to maintain their footing as the chamber's structure twisted and groaned. Malcolm's face was pale with fear, but there was determination in his eyes. "We need to stop them now, or there won't be anything left to save." Evelyn nodded, a plan forming in her mind. They had to destroy the conduit, whatever it was that kept the rift open. The pedestal had been at the center of the ritual, but now that the energy had fused with the chamber itself, it was harder to pinpoint the exact location of the core. It felt as though the power had become part of the very walls, flowing through the ancient runes that lined every surface. Suddenly, a burst of light flared up from the center of the room, and the ground shook beneath them. The core of the energy, the heart of the rift, was now exposed. It was a pulsing orb of raw, radiant power, surrounded by swirling tendrils of energy that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The creatures, their forms now semi-solid, hovered around it, their eyes glowing with a mix of anticipation and hunger. The ritual was nearly complete. Evelyn's breath hitched as she realized how close they were to losing everything. She scanned the chamber quickly, her eyes darting from the orb to the shifting forms of the creatures. They were too powerful now. The creatures had merged with the rift's energy, and they had begun to warp the laws of physics itself. "We need to reverse the energy flow," Evelyn said, her voice steady with resolve. "If we can destabilize the core, we can collapse the rift. But we don't have much time." Malcolm moved toward the pedestal where the runes had flared earlier. "I'll try to reroute the energy." If I can link the disruptor to the core, we can create a feedback loop. Before they could act, one of the creatures, its form shifting between liquid and solid, advanced toward them. It wasn't just guarding the core anymore. It was feeding from it, drawing strength from the rift, and using it to manipulate their reality. "Get back," Evelyn shouted, raising her weapon. It was a futile gesture against the power they faced, but she had to try. The creature lashed out with a wave of dark energy, sending the team tumbling backward. The force was overwhelming, knocking them off their feet. As they struggled to stand, Evelyn's eyes locked onto the rift's core. A deep, primal fear settled over her as she realized that it wasn't just the creatures that were manipulating the energy, it was the very nature of the rift itself. The entities weren't just trying to return to their world. They were recreating it. The core pulsed violently. The room flickered, and for a split second, Evelyn could see flashes of strange alien landscapes, a world far removed from Earth, a place of endless storm clouds, vast deserts of glass, and towering structures of jagged metal. It was a world shaped by the entities, their home, and it was about to bleed into Earth. If the rift completed its full opening, Earth would be reshaped, its very essence twisted into something alien, and humanity would be erased. "We have to sever their link to the rift," Evelyn screamed, realizing the full scale of what was happening. The creatures, as ancient as they were, had never fully understood the consequences of their actions. They were so focused on returning to their home that they hadn't realized the rift was unstable. The energy they were tapping into wasn't just their own. It was consuming everything it touched, threatening to tear apart the very fabric of Earth itself. Malcolm's fingers danced across the disruptor's controls, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's now or never," he said, sweat dripping down his face. "I need a direct link to the core. I can't do this from here." Evelyn's heart raced as she realized what needed to be done. She had to get close enough to the core to link the disruptor to it directly. But the creatures weren't going to let that happen without a fight. "We hold them off," she said to Malcolm, determination flooding her voice. "You make it happen." Before he could protest, Evelyn was already moving. She sprinted toward the core, her mind focused on one singular goal: to end this before Earth was torn apart. The creatures surged forward, their forms twisting and flickering as they tried to block her path. She fired, sending bursts of energy toward the first creature, but it wasn't enough. The power of the rift made them nearly invulnerable. Evelyn pushed on, ignoring the burning sensation in her muscles, her thoughts clear. She had to reach the core. She had to make sure this ended now. As the core pulsed once more, she made her move, diving toward it with everything she had left. The rift's power swarmed around her, pushing her to the edge of her limits. But she reached the heart of it, her fingers touching the pulsating orb of energy. And in that moment, everything shifted. Evelyn's fingers brushed against the core, and the world around her seemed to vanish in a surge of white-hot energy. The rift's power flooded through her like a torrent, raw and overwhelming, every cell in her body screaming in agony. The core's pulsing rhythm reverberated in her chest, like the heartbeat of some ancient beast, thundering with unstoppable force. For a moment, everything felt as if it were on the brink of collapse. Time stretched and twisted in strange, disjointed ways. The creatures around her screamed, their forms flickering as they fought against the energy surging through them. Their physical bodies shimmered, as though the very fabric of reality was buckling under their power. But Evelyn held on. She reached for the resonance disruptor in her belt, now dim and flickering with the last vestiges of its power. The device had been designed to overload the rift's energy, to reverse the flow, but it needed a direct connection. Her hand shook as she attached it to the core, sending the final pulse of energy through the chamber. The creatures shrieked in unison, their bodies writhing in agony as the energy shifted. They were no longer in control. The disruptor's pulse began to work, slowly at first, then with increasing force. The rift's power started to falter, the violent tendrils of energy retracting from the chamber, their grip on the room loosening. Evelyn could feel the rift's heartbeat slowing, its pulse growing faint as the disruptor tore into the conduit, destabilizing the flow of power. The creatures recoiled, unable to maintain their connection to the rift. Their forms flickered erratically, like fading shadows, struggling to hold onto the energy they had so desperately tapped into. "Come on," Evelyn muttered, her body aching with exhaustion as she fought to keep the disruptor active. The core of the rift groaned, its power beginning to collapse in on itself. But just as victory seemed within reach, the remaining creatures surged forward, drawn to the core by some primal instinct. One of them, the largest and most formidable, was not retreating but charging directly at her. Its glowing eyes were filled with rage, its form pulsing with the rift's dark energy, now more monstrous than ever. It was not willing to lose, not without a final confrontation. With a roar, the creature lunged at Evelyn, its tendrils of energy wrapping around her, pulling her away from the core. Her breath caught as the energy of the rift surged once more, threatening to crush her under its weight. "No," she screamed, trying to break free, but the creature's grip tightened, its strength amplified by the rift's power. The room trembled, and the walls seemed to crack as the core's energy fluctuated violently. Malcolm's voice cut through the chaos. "Evelyn, you have to finish it, now." Evelyn's vision blurred as the creature's power squeezed tighter. Her heart raced, but she wasn't about to give in. She could feel the disruptor pulsing in her hand, the last chance they had to stop the rift from consuming them all. Gritting her teeth, she focused all her energy on the device. It was now or never. With a final, desperate push, she activated the disruptor. A blinding wave of light surged through the chamber, washing over everything in its path. The creature screamed in agony, its form disintegrating as the energy was ripped from it. The rift's power, now uncontrollable, imploded. For a fraction of a second, the world held its breath. Then the rift collapsed. The blinding light of the disruptor intensified, and the power of the rift began to unravel at its core. The creature that had held her captive was torn apart in the energy surge, its form collapsing into nothingness as the rift's energy drained away. The chamber began to tremble as the rift closed, its vast force sucked back into the void it had come from, leaving nothing but an eerie calm. The ground beneath them ceased shaking, and the oppressive weight of the energy vanished. Silence fell over the chamber, broken only by the sound of their heavy breaths. Evelyn collapsed to her knees, the strain of the past moments taking its toll on her body. The energy that had once felt all-consuming now seemed like a distant nightmare. Malcolm rushed to her side, his face pale but filled with relief. "Evelyn, we did it." Evelyn looked up, her vision blurry but her heart steady. The rift was gone, its influence erased, and the creatures that had once threatened to tear the world apart were nothing more than fading memories. The tea was safe for now, but Evelyn knew this victory was just the beginning. There would be consequences. There always were. The room was still in ruins, the remnants of the rift and the battle scattering the chamber. Yet there was a quiet sense of finality. Humanity had faced an ancient, incomprehensible force, and had won. But Evelyn's gaze lingered on the fading ruins of the pedestal, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the first chapter of a much larger story. There were still mysteries to uncover, more forces at play than they could ever have imagined. The rift might have been sealed, but the ancient entities weren't finished yet, and neither was Earth's journey into the unknown. "We need to leave," she said, her voice calm but firm. "There's more to this than we know." And as they made their way out of the chamber, Evelyn couldn't help but wonder, how long would it be before the next rift opened?